All right, everyone. Welcome again to the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today we have a special guest, Christine Peterson, co-founder of the Foresight Institute. Christine, how are you doing today?
Great. Happy to be here, Joe.
Well, excellent. I'm glad to have you on. For those of you who do not know Christine Peterson, as mentioned before, she's a co-founder of the Foresight Institute and coiner of the term open source. Christine, first question, what is open source to you? And just a follow-up question after that, what is the story of you coining the term?
Okay, well, I think the understanding of the term open source is pretty established at this point. This year is the 20th anniversary of the term open source being applied to software. So after 20 years, we've kind of got that well understood, at least in that community, which is you're talking about software code that is easily accessible and that can be changed by anyone and used by anyone at no charge. So it's a type of software code that can be thought of as shared by the wide community and not owned by one proprietary company or individual who controls it. And then you also asked about how that came to happen. How did that naming occur? What had happened was that this type of code was increasingly becoming more popular, and it was, there's another name for it, which is the term free software. Now, free, what they mean by free software is they mean free as in freedom. But there's this problem in the English language. Free has two common meanings. One is free as in freedom, but the other one, which is much more common, is free as in price. And the problem we were running into back then, 20 years ago, was that new customers for this type of software would arrive, they would be told it's free, and they would assume it meant the price. And then when they found out that no, it actually is more complicated than that, it's not, unless you're a programmer, you really need help and you're going to have to pay for that help, then they'd get annoyed because here they had been told that it was free. They assumed that meant free as in price, and then they're told, no, sorry, it's not something that you as a non-programmer can use without help from a programmer. And so we realized, all right, this is a problem. It's a problem that they don't have in other countries because many other languages like Spanish have different words for these two meanings of free. In Spanish, the two are gratis, meaning free as in price, and libre, meaning free as in freedom. But in English, it's the same word. So we had this ongoing confusion among the new people. And so the community, many of us felt, all right, we need an additional name. It doesn't have to displace the old name, but especially for new people, to help them learn the concept, we need a new name. And so I happened to propose the term open source. There was a vote among some of the leaders of the community. They said, hey, that's good enough. And I guess 20 years later, we see, yes, it has been good enough. It has educated many non-technical people about the benefits of this type of software. So that's the story.
Well, excellent. And it's really intriguing that it just sort of caught on. And in fact, in some of the accounts that I've read, you've actually did a little bit of an open source trick in order to disperse it among the leaders. Instead of simply suggesting that the term should be open source, one of the leaders just simply started using the term, and then it started just be randomly starting to be used among the group. And then after that, when they became conscious of the word, did they actually solidify it as the term that they plan to use?
That's true. That is exactly how it was done, and I think it was a very clever strategy, which actually was not my strategy. We were at one of the leadership meetings. At the time, I am a non-programmer, and so I am not one of the leaders of this community. I happen to be present, and I had this agenda of trying to introduce this term, but I had gone over it with one of the other meeting attendees, and I could see it was going to be awkward to try to get these folks who are these folks are very, very smart people. I had no particular standing in that community. And I realized they are not going to necessarily listen to me if I say, hey, you guys need to change the name of your movement. So one of these other folks who was more involved realized that maybe the way to do it was just start using the term at that meeting. Just throw it out there, use it very casually. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just pretend it's already out there and see what happened. And of course, I was sitting there, so I noticed right away, but nobody else at the table really noticed that a new term had been thrown out until a few minutes later, when one of the other leadership who wasn't in on the concept just spontaneously used the term also. And that's when I and my partner there in this little project looked at each other and thought, wow, we've had a mimetic jump. The meme of the term open source software has successfully spread to this, has made its first tiny movement to this community. And by the end of that meeting, pretty casually, the group had sort of said, yeah, that's a pretty good term. Maybe we'll go with that term. And then very soon after that, the vote was taken at a subsequent meeting. So yes, it was kind of a stealth strategy. And I think in that community with so many, it's kind of like herding cats. They're very independent folks. I love them, but they're super independent. And so I think this sort of subtle strategy was the right way to do it, rather than trying to hit them over the head with a hammer and say, hey, you guys are using the wrong term.
And that's precisely one of the reasons why it's so important to talk to you, Christine. Besides you being in many of the networks related to startup societies and governance, there's a lot of similarities between the open source community and in the startup societies community, also in its objectives, especially in terms of herding cats. And of course, one of the biggest initiatives that we're pursuing right now at the Startup Societies Foundation is ULEX, an open source legal system. So while automating the processes of ULEX, which is curated by Tom W. Bell from multiple international sources, the term open source as he applies it isn't referring necessarily to the software component, but the idea of open law. Do you think, based on your experience, that ULEX fits the description of open source?
Oh yes, the term open source over these 20 years since it was first applied to software has spread far, far beyond software. And if you go online and read about open source, you'll see that it's applied to many, many other fields now. You'll find things like open source medicine, open source architecture, open source design of just about any product you can imagine. So yes, the design of ULEX, as I understand it, does fit this broader definition of open source, where you've got a body of knowledge, a body of information that is freely available, and individuals and groups are welcome to adopt it either as is or change it and use and customize it for their own use. And share that, and then share that. So it's, this material is not patented. It's not using a traditional copyright where you're not allowed to reproduce it without permission of the copyright owner. The goal is to make it very widely used and widely modified and widely shared. So yes, I would definitely say that in terms of the broader use of the term open source, that ULEX totally does qualify.
So drawing off of this sort of analogy of ULEX as open source, and it meets all the criteria, it makes me think about what the next steps are. So the Startup Societies Foundation recently concluded their crowdfunding campaign. The main point is creating applications that spur collaboration and to give grants for research. But one of the biggest elements of the open source software movement wasn't necessarily the technology infrastructure. It was the social infrastructure. It was the institutions. It was the marketing and promotion and the outreach associated to bring all these programmers and needs and businesses together to build open source community. what are some similar steps we can take in the ULEX community to build an open source legal system?
Wow, that is a huge, huge question. I think we need to look, I think we can look at the software world for inspiration to try to say, okay, how have they gotten as far as they have in what they're doing? And I think that the thing to do would be to systematically make a list of all the tools that they have developed over the years to help them work together more effectively. These include systems like Reddit and GitHub and many other tools that the community has learned over time help the group work together more effectively. So I think the first step would be to kind of analyze open source software, how it is done, how have they been so successful, and say, all right, how do we translate that into thinking about first legal documentation, the actual legal codes in the sense of text codes. And then eventually, of course, we want to move all of this into some kind of automated software system because your average person out in the world is not going to wade through a lot of text. They need simple interfaces that that they can use without having to read a bunch of legal documentation. People just aren't going to do that. So with the goal is to have a system that is simple enough and understandable enough that your average person out there in the world, who may very likely be in a country with a non-optimal legal code now, and they want to do a deal with their neighbor or a colleague, and both parties realize that they're in a dysfunctional legal system, and so they are willing to explore, all right, how are we going to do this in a way that is fair to both parties? We want to do business together, we want to do this deal, but we just don't trust our legal system. So if we can get this thing coded up with a user interface that is simple and easy for people to understand, and I really feel that's going to be possible because the concepts behind ULEX are very straightforward. There are 3 basic principles. They're very simple and understandable by anyone, I think. If we can code that up into a nice interface so that people can simply and easily reach their agreements, and then if necessary, if there is a dispute, use the system to get it resolved quickly in the most reasonable fashion possible. And Joe, I know that you're aware that the ULEX principles sort of they very strongly guide the any disputes that arise in the most reasonable possible direction, and I think that's going to be just wonderful and magical for people who are stuck in systems that don't have that as a tendency in their legal systems.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. In the Institute for Competitive Governance, one of the main reasons we did the crowdfunding, why we're forming the open source community, is to automate it with software. The big point is to reduce the cost of entry for all these different people who wouldn't be able to access legal systems. If you're able to do it through a really simple UI and automate it really cheaply, that could be a way to bring in the whole globe into an effective, fair legal system. But there's another element of it as well. Once we move beyond a centralized software, because I'm sure the open source community will probably want to start with a centralized software. Eventually, they'll want to move on to some distributed ledger technology, such as blockchains on Ethereum or EOS, or maybe even a out there distributed ledger technology like Holochain. The importance of that is to bring the sense of transparency and immutability. How important is transparency in the open source movement broadly?
Well, I think it's central. It's a central principle. If you think about open source software, I'll speak for a moment to the folks in the among the listeners who have never written software code, and I have very rarely written any. There's 2 kinds of software code. There's the kind that a human being sits down and writes and that other human beings can understand. And then there's another version that the computer can understand. And human beings look at it and they cannot understand it. the great majority of software that is sold by private companies, the proprietary software that is not open source, is in the second form. Human beings can't read it, they can't change it, and even if they could do so, it would be illegal because of the terms of the software license. So instead, with open source, you provide the human readable version of the code. That's called the source code. That's something that a human programmer can understand and change. So, and how do we know what software is doing? Well, unless we have that human readable version, we have no idea what the software is doing. So the entire principle of open source software is dependent on this transparency. We require and we demand in open source software, we demand to see the human readable version, and we want to have the freedom to change it if it does not meet our needs. So yeah, transparency is critical. Another big plus of transparency in this context is if there is an error in the programming, a security problem, for example, you're much more likely to see it if a human being can actually see the human readable version, the source code. Because if they don't have that, all they have is machine readable software, and a human being can't analyze it. There's no way to spot what the problems are. So one of the benefits of this transparency is if you're not sure whether this software is secure and is protecting your privacy and so on, an expert in the area, someone who can program, can look at that code, the human readable version, and say, okay, I see how this works, and your safety is fine, your privacy is fine, it looks secure to me. Or he or she might say, whoa, this software is sending your data off into this third world country. Who knows what they're doing with it over there? So yeah, transparency is a very, very fundamental principle of the entire open source software movement.
So while transparency has practical applications, there's many of these principles such as transparency, low cost to access, that are pretty idealistic. But unfortunately, in order to be used in the real world, there has to be an embeddedness in existing institutions and buy-in from older institutions and legacy institutions. And in fact, open source software has really taken off in part because of buy-in from large institutions like Microsoft. What are some ways in which ULEX can get buy-in from large legacy institutions and make it more commonplace?
Well, I think the three principles that ULEX is based on are so obviously good ideas. Once you hear them, right? Once you hear what these three basic principles are, I think many people, including, I think, large organizations, even in countries with relatively good legal systems, relatively fair ones, might look at these and say, you know, this makes a lot of sense. And we would rather do our deals under this set of rules rather than have the prospect of having to fight it out in the traditional court system. Here in the US, we have a perfectly functioning court system, but it's expensive. It often delivers judgments which are extreme and then have to go to appeal. So there's all this money spent on these disputes, when if they had used ULEX and its three very fair, very reasonable principles, I think they could resolve these things much faster and avoid having all these expensive appeals and avoid these extreme judgments that come out of especially jury trials here in the United States.
So taking a little pivot here, I want to draw upon your experience as co-founder of the Foresight Institute. It's as far as I can tell, it's an institution that focuses on revolutionary technologies. Originally founded on focusing on nanotechnology, focused on cybersecurity and longevity and others. In what ways can governance in general, or ULEX specifically, help in the enveloping and the creation of revolutionary technologies?
Well, that's a great question. I would say that if there's one thing that innovators need, and I say technological innovators, or scientific innovators, or has come to think of it, almost any type of innovator needs. When you innovate, you're innovating in a specific area. Let's say you're doing a biomedical technology. Let's say you're working on a new longevity treatment that is going to remove senescent cells from the body, decrease the burden of senescent cells on the body. You're working on a very hard scientific and technical problem. What you want to avoid is uncertainty in other areas of the world that you're trying to function in particular legal uncertainties. So innovation is furthered when the innovators are free to focus on the areas that they are pioneering specifically and are not distracted by uncertainties and unreasonable behavior in other systems that they're depending on, especially the legal system. So I would say if we can get ULEX more widely adopted, and not just in places that have very seriously malfunctioning legal systems, I would say even in the more developed countries as well, even in the United States, in Europe, Japan, all these places, anywhere that the legal system is either too expensive or leads to these excessive judgments that then have to go to appeal and be redone by a later judge. That's going to help innovation, because when funders fund innovation right now, they have to realize, and they do, these are smart people, that there's this huge legal uncertainty, and that if there's some kind of a lawsuit, which could potentially be lost or even won, there's these huge legal costs associated with participating in this lawsuit. Even if they win it, there are costs. Huge amount of time, distraction by the innovators from what they're trying to do. So if we can simplify and streamline and make more reasonable the legal system, it should benefit innovators in every other area.
So we have a concluding question right here. The Startup Society's motto is "Don't argue, build," meaning that we should take practical steps rather than simply talking about it. And it seems that you have already created a practical step forward for ULEX. You've already built ULEX-compatible procedures when dealing with sexual assault in small, temporary, intentional communities. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, there's been a huge discussion lately in the United States and around the world, I think, about how we need to treat allegations of sexual assault differently. And I think almost everyone agrees that it's not handled well now. I don't know, and I haven't looked at the question of whether ULEX would be a better method of handling criminal charges. I don't know, and that's beyond my area of expertise by far. However, I have watched a couple of intentional communities here in the Bay Area attempt to struggle with this question of how do you deal, if you're a small private community, how do you deal with allegations of sexual misbehavior? These are not things that necessarily merit going to a criminal trial, but they're things that are upsetting the community a great deal. And so we need some kind of process, a fair process, a simple process that these communities can use to work through disputes that may arise among their membership. And I would say, sexual assault isn't the only one. I would say any kind of internal dispute between two members of a private community could be handled using the basic ULEX principles. They're very simple, very straightforward, and totally sensible. So I put together a draft. It's very preliminary for how it could be used in cases of some kind of allegation of, I would not say that what I've come up with would be useful in the cases of, say, an actual rape. Those I would say, we really, in those cases, we really need to bring in the experts and probably the legal system, the traditional legal system. but more minor offenses or alleged offenses that may come up, I think that the ULEX principles provide a lot of guidance, and I think they could help us resolve these kinds of disputes in a much faster and more reasonable and calm fashion that would avoid splitting the communities between the friends and allies of the person making the allegation and the friends and allies of the person who is the allegation is against. So that's my suggestion. You know, I have a very rough draft. We have a long, long way to go before we have a great procedure, but it's a step in the right direction compared to some of the stuff I've seen here in the Bay Area, which has been pretty, it hasn't been as fair as I would like to see. So yeah, it's a first step, but I think there are going to be so many applications of ULEX that this is just a tiny, tiny example of the kinds of things we can do.
Well, even if it's preliminary, I'm super excited to see that there's already practical applications and steps forward being taken. Christine, I want to thank you for joining us on our podcast. And while software has already eaten the world and continues to, let's hope that a legal system based on effective rule of law and freedom eats the whole universe.
Right, Joe. Well, it's been great being on.